Hello again and welcome to another Mordian Glory, the old world video. In today's episode, I'm going to give my hot takes on all of the core factions in the old world. Their pros, their cons, their strengths and weaknesses. And this ain't no theory craft either. I will be basing this on my own tournament experience and my time fighting with or against these armies. And so, without further ado, let's not mess around any further. Let's grab a halberd and hold the line right into today's episode. Attention, guardsmen. My ever-salty partner in crime, Admiral Simon, has got an important announcement for you.
This September and October, I am doing a charity walk along the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu. We'll be raising money for two fantastic charities, our local hospice, Halton Haven, and also the Pink Ribbon Foundation, that raises funds to combat breast cancer. As I hate camping, walking, and will be shitting in a bucket for 4 days, I will be particularly salty and would value any support you can give us. Please click the link below for our Just Giving page. Thank you very much.
You heard the man, it's for a good cause, and you all know Simon from the battle reports. That's all for now. Move out, conscripts. Let's begin with my personal favourite faction, and one which I know is very popular, the Empire of Man. Now, Empire has had a bit of a bumpy ride. At the start of Old World, when the game was first released, it was not looked upon very favourably, with their characters looking somewhat lackluster and their humble state troops, the core of their army, looking downright feeble. A lot of people took Empire of Man. They tried to play them and they got resoundingly beaten and they felt a little weak. But as the meta has evolved and people have begun to get to grips with their factions a bit more, Empire of Man has slowly yet steadily risen in terms of its power. And a big part of that is they have some of the best artillery and guns in the game. The iconic and classic Great Cannon is, frankly, great, and it puts Dwarf Cannons to shame. I never leave home without a brace of Great Cannons, and I know most other Empire players don't either. It is the first thing that goes into every list, because it just handles one of the things that Empire struggles with, and that's big monsters. We can't really bring them down in combat. We can tie them up a little bit with tar pits, maybe we can screw them a little bit with magic, but it's the Great Cannons which are actually going to kill them. Sure, some big monsters are going to have ward saves and or regen saves, but even so, a brace of Great Cannons tends to solve one of the biggest weaknesses of this army. And on top of that, the Hellblaster volley gun is frankly broken and probably the best unit in the entire Empire force. And one thing that I don't think anyone expected is Empire has access to some of the best magic as well. Firstly, we can take pretty much all of the main laws of magic. The only one we don't have access to is high magic. And because our characters don't have very impressive stat lines, we don't pay for things that we might not necessarily use. Sure, a high elf mage on a dragon is going to be an ungodly force to reckon with, but you're going to get 3 level 4 Empire wizards for the same cost as that one guy. That's 3 times the fireballs and, more importantly, 3 times the pillars of fire, and that is an amazing spell and Empire can really spam it. So the Empire meta is very much shooting and magic focused, with just a little bit of combat here and there to try and slow the enemy down. But what's really funny is, despite the fact that most Empire players know this is the best way to play, the vast majority of them choose not to. At the end of the day, the reason a lot of people collect this faction is because they love the idea of the state troops. They love the idea of the great swords. They just love the idea of the infantry trying to hold the line whilst cavalry hit them on the flanks. As a result, you will find that most Empire armies still contain a lot of infantry, they contain a lot of cavalry, and even though it might not be the best way to play, it's the way that a lot of people like to run their army. So Empire tends to be run in quite a fluffy way, but don't underestimate them if you go to a tournament, because they definitely have a number of ways of really being able to compete now. It just took a little while for us to find out what they were. Next up, we have the Dwarven Mountain Holds. Quite possibly my second favorite faction in the entire game. Now, dwarves are quite a strong faction, but they do have a bit of a weakness, which is holding them back on the tournament scene. We'll circle back to that in a moment. Looking at their stat lines, a lot of dwarf units seem real chunky. You do have some stinkers like the Slayers, but longbeards that can be taken as core and given great weapons are lethal. I have used them at multiple tournaments, and my opponents have laminated themselves against these things. You also get access to characters that can genuinely go toe-to-toe with some of the best combat factions out there. I've had Dwarf Lords go into combat with Chaos Lords, and it's been dicey which way that combat's going to go. When I've ever tried that with my Empire, the Chaos always win. So they've got some really strong, chunky characters. They've got some really, really beefy units. And they've got some proper standout, like infamous guys as well, like the Hammerers. No one, I'm going to say that again, no one really wants to charge a unit of Hammerers. Often you will find people kill everything around the Hammerers, and the Hammerers are kind of left trying to just sort of catch up. People will take them head on. Maybe they'll do it. Maybe they won't. But no one really wants to go into a unit of Hammerers straight up. And then you've got Iron Breakers, where the Iron Breakers probably aren't going to kill you, but you're not going to kill them either. And they're a very, very good tar pit. Also, dwarves have got access to possibly the best magical items in the game, in my opinion, in the form of runes, because they basically get to build a bear. They get to custom tailor runes and magical weapons to exactly what they want. You can build some very specific but very good dwarf builds, whereas everyone else has just a list of magical items, and then they're like, well, I'll take this sword and it should be good in most games, but there might be a situation where it just isn't. Dwarves don't have that. They can build very specific things, or they can build very general things, but either way, their magical items are going to be strong. Where dwarves perhaps struggle a little bit, and this may be just the fact that they're overshadowed somewhat by the Empire of Man, is in the gun department. In previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy, dwarf cannons were the best. But now, with the fact they only do D3 damage, it does feel like they're a little lackluster. I fire great cannons and giants fall over. I fire dwarf cannons and giants keep going. And whilst the organ gun is significantly more reliable and less likely to blow itself up than the Hellblaster volley gun, that is because it just fires less shots. So it feels like dwarves are more of a combat army than a shooting army, although of course never underestimate dwarf shooting because they can still do it if they want to. But the problem with dwarves is because they're a little bit more combat-like now, it really shows their weakness. This is the big thing we were talking about before. Movement. What is holding dwarves back in a competitive sense is they sometimes struggle to flatten their enemies. You'll have a Warriors of Chaos army that will go in and just get 2,000 victory points. And maybe it'll give up a little bit of its own, but it's going to get 2,000 victory points. Dwarves, if they start winning, because they don't necessarily have the movement to pin the enemy down, the player that is against them could start pulling back a little bit, kiting them a bit. And so you get to the end of the game where the dwarves have won, but maybe they've only won by 200 to 300 points, unlike some other more balls to the wall factions, which have won by 1,000 plus. So dwarves do tend to win games, but they don't win them in such a big manner where they can start consistently winning tournaments. Because if you've got someone who's won 3 games of Dwarven Mountain Holds, but they've only beaten their opponents by 200 to 300 points each time, and then you've got someone who's running Warriors of Chaos, and they have won all 3 games as well at a tournament, but they've then won them all by 1,000 points, the Warriors of Chaos guy is going to take the gold. Our next faction is on completely the opposite end of the spectrum to the dwarves. One of the more maneuverable armies, it is the Kingdom of Bretonnia. The Bretonnians are the quintessential cavalry faction of the game. And whilst there will be other armies which have individual units which are better than the Bretonnian cavalry, by and large, they are going to have the best cavalry overall in the game. One of the greatest strengths of Bretonnia is that they will typically be charging you. Because of their speed, they are going to be coming at you again and again and again. And when you're fighting against the Bretonnians, it often feels like you're holding off wave attacks, But those wave attacks aren't being made by ill-trained conscripts, they're being made by some of the best shock cavalry. The reason why Bretonnians are such a chargy faction comes down to fundamentally because they have a lot of cavalry, so they're going to have long charge ranges, they've got swift stride, they've got things like Bretonnian warhorses, you can spec into the Outry Crusade to get even longer charges, so just they've got a lot of mechanics baked into them which makes them a charging faction. But there's more to it than that. Bretonnians hit well, but they don't take hits as well as they should. When they charge, they're going to get bonuses to their initiative, they're going to get bonuses to their strength because of the lances, and they also have the lance formation, so they can get a lot of attacks coming in on you. They've also got a pretty decent weapon skill, so overall they just hit quite well. And then the enemy doesn't get as many attacks back. And that's really where the Bretonnian durability comes from. Because most of their guys are still toughness 3. And they've got a 3+ armor save, which is decent. A lot of factions can't get up to a 3+ armor save. But they're only 1 wound. And so the Bretonnians need to be charging. They need to be killing a lot of the enemy front ranks. Because if the enemy gets a decent volume of attacks back, even if they're just like spears or hand weapons, which hasn't got a lot of AP, the Bretonnians are going to start crumbling surprisingly quickly. And even though when you see a Bretonnian army, it looks very large because there's these knight lances and long formations, they're actually not very wound dense. A big lance of 10 Knights of the Realm has 10 wounds. My brick of 30 to 40 halberdiers has got 4 times the wounds and yet will be costing about the same points as that lance of Bretonnians. It might even be quite a bit cheaper. And the reason this matters is because Bretonnians struggle in wars of attrition. They want to charge and break you. If they can't charge and break you, they want to charge you, force you to fall back in good order, and then follow up so that they get to keep hammering you. And Bretonnians will hammer you. But if you can hold them, or if they charge into something that they can't deal with, then they are going to start falling like flies. The Bretonnians are very fast, they're very hitty, but they're not as durable as they might seem. If you're playing against Bretonnians, there is one particular unit you need to keep an eye out for. And if you're planning on using Bretonnians, this guy should be the first thing that goes into every list. There are a few ways to build this Duke, but one of the more popular ways is to give him the virtue of heroism, and that gives him Killing Blow and Monster Slayer. You have him on a flying mount, and he just goes around lone wolf picking up any big monsters on the other side of the table. One last thing to say about the Horse Lords is they are a very popular faction. This is because they were in one of the starter boxes when Old World launched. So if you are building for a tournament, you definitely want to be taking into account the Bretonnians because you're more than likely going to be facing them. But one faction which you rarely see, despite the fact that some say they are one of the most powerful, is the Wood Elf Realms. Over the last 9 months of playing this game, and having been to half a dozen tournaments and played many practice games as well, I have seen Wood Elves exactly once. And this is incredibly surprising because their reputation of being one of the hardest factions to beat and one of the more powerful armies has preceded them. And this has been something people have been talking about since Old World launched. Their longbows outrange pretty much everyone else's troops. Even war machines that can target them, like cannons, aren't very effective against them. And the war machines that would be good against them, like organ guns and hellpasser volley guns, they outrange again with their elven longbows. And it's this shooting focus with the maneuverability that distinguishes them from other shooting armies such as Empire. An Empire gun line is going to deploy and it is going to shoot you and shoot you. And it's probably going to get a couple of turns. And then once the smoke is cleared, the Empire player is going to be praying to Sigmar that the enemy is either routed or is so badly weakened that he can beat them in combat. A Wood Elf player is going to be constantly shooting and moving. So there's no 2 turns of prayer, there is just constant moving, constant arrows, and getting to grips with them is really, really tricky and can be a little frustrating. But they do have 2 big weaknesses. The first one is they're incredibly fragile. If you can get some shots into them, you will cause casualties. And if you can get to grips with them, they're going to fold like a wet paper bag. I'm talking even Empire State Troops can beat them in combat. And Empire State Troops struggle against like Skaven and Goblins. And the other big weakness is they need room to maneuver. Now on a big 6x4 board, typically they probably will have the space that they need. But if you can close the distance quickly, you might be able to catch them off guard. But more importantly, I have seen Wood Elves genuinely struggle on a smaller board. On the 60x44 boards, which a lot of tournaments and a lot of venues have. In fact, the tournament where I saw the Wood Elves play was at one which was using the smaller boards. And in the first game, they were okay because they were able to sit back and plink away against an army that was kind of slow moving. But in the second game, they played against my mate Alex with his Chaos, who just bum rushed it up the board super fast using magic and cavalry and knights. And the Wood Elves couldn't maneuver. There weren't the little spaces on the flanks. There weren't the places to scout at the beginning of the game. And essentially they got one turn of shooting and the Chaos were all over them and they got crushed. So they might be fast and they might be deadly, but they are not unbeatable. Now we've had one elf faction, yes, but what about second elf faction? And here we have the High Elf realms. On the surface, High Elves and Wood Elves might seem kind of similar. They're both quite fast and they also have a very fragile stat line whilst being quite expensive per model, making them somewhat elite. However, the reality is that they play completely differently. Whilst Wood Elves are happy to keep you at arm's length the entire game, High Elves are going to be coming at you. Now that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be charging headlong into the fray with their entire army like the Kingdom of Bretonnia. No, High Elves are somewhat more balanced. You'll probably find a couple of bricks of infantry, you might find one of Sea Guard, which are one of their better core choices, and you might find things like the Phoenix Guard as well, which are pretty tough and have also got a good amount of damage output with their ceremonial halberds. I mean, straight away, this differentiates them from the Wood Elves who don't want to be getting into a stand-up fight at all. But really where the High Elves shine is their magic and specifically their mages on dragons. One of the most powerful High Elf builds at the moment is the double ethereal dragon. This is where you take two high-level wizards and you put them on top of a cheap-ish dragon, because even a cheap dragon is still a pretty big deal, and they have a spell which can make the dragon and the rider ethereal. This means that they're almost immune to damage unless someone has really specced into shooting magic missiles. Now these dragons move quickly and they can also reserve move as well. So the mages are going to be flying forward, shooting spells at you, laying down templates which are going to slow you down. They're going to be ethereal, and then before you know it, they're going to be over your back lines running rampant. And they're going to be moving and reserve moving, doing all of this. So kind of like Wood Elves where they're tricksy and they're going to be running and shooting and stuff. But imagine that instead of a bow, it's a goddamn dragon with a dude on top just yeeting magic missiles into you. This double dragon build is quite tasty because not only can it do a lot of damage, but it also is quite points dense. So even if you kill everything around double dragon, there's probably still about half or nearly half of the enemy's points locked up in these two units. And those units are quite hard to get to grips with. The reason why High Elves aren't just taking the entire meta by storm is because this sort of double dragon approach is really good until suddenly it's not. If they do encounter a faction which has plenty of magical weapons and plenty of magic and plenty of magical range stuff, then suddenly the toughness 5 sort of wish.com dragon that they're riding around on isn't all that special. One of the factions that can deal with dragons is dwarves, because they can put runes on their cannons and then they become magical and then they're just eating cannonballs into dragons. Another faction which is quite good into them is Warriors of Chaos, because they're going to have their own magical dragons flying around, and also they can have wizards which will put out like 3 magic missiles each, just spamming loads and loads of damage at range that just cuts through that ethereal. And surprisingly, Empire have got better at dealing with them as well, because like I said, you could do it with like 3 level 4s as Empire and just start spamming fireballs and all sorts of magical missiles into them, which again gets past that ethereal. So high elves are really, really difficult to deal with until suddenly they're not. Now that covers all of the forces of fantasy, the good guys in the core factions. Now let's get over to the ravening hordes, starting off with the orcs and goblins. The greenskin menace is a force to be reckoned with, and one which is very, very popular. You go to a tournament, you're going to face orcs and gobbos, and you're going to need to be prepared for them. And this could be quite difficult to do because they have a very broad army roster. There are lots and lots of different ways to play your orcs and goblins, and not only that, there's lots and lots of different very competitive ways to play your orcs and goblins. Unlike some of the other factions, which will have lots of soft builds, but then maybe like one or two good competitive builds, orcs and goblins have got lots of different ways that they can compete. One of the slightly less fluffy but very effective playstyles of the orcs and goblins is the artillery core. Orcs and gobbos get the bolt throwers, they have the stone throwers, they've got the doom divers, and they're all quite cheap. And so an orc and goblin artillery gun line is very possible, and as someone who's been on the receiving end of one more than once, it is very deadly. Another popular and powerful way to run them is really leaning into the night goblin. The humble night gobbo isn't much to look at, but when you can take a fanatic for every 10 night goblins, suddenly it's squeaky bum time. Fanatics are a really good defensive unit because you push them out of the front of your night goblin mobs as the enemy starts getting close. Because of the way the rules are worded, you can actually push them out in your opponent's turn, and there's nothing more hair-raising than trying to charge down a unit of night gobbos, and suddenly your charge is going to have to go through 3 of their fanatics. You could lose the majority of a unit, the majority of your combat punch, and then the little green buggers are laughing at you when they then chuck nets on you, so even you do get there, you hardly do any damage at all. But it's not just defensively where night goblins can shine. They also have a number of offensive units. Really, we're looking at their squigs. The normal squig herd is kind of slow, but it's cheap, and if it gets to you, it'll munch you. What you really want to look out for though is the mangler squigs and the squig hoppers. These units have got random movement, which means you can't stand and shoot against them, and it makes it very hard to predict when those quote unquote charges, because they don't technically charge you, are going to connect. Sometimes they're going to get across that field in 2 turns and just boing right into you. Sometimes it might take a little bit longer, but the enemy gets to see what random movement they roll for, and then they get to play with it. On top of this, all of the squig units have got immune to psychology, so trying to shoot them down before they get to you is a fool's errand. And then the squig hoppers have also got skirmish, making it even harder to gun the little buggers down. The one weakness of orc and goblins is meant to be impetuous, but thanks to easy access to black orcs, they can pretty much quell all of the impetuosity in their army, making them a surprisingly disciplined and well organized force. However, for all of their power, the orc and goblin community is still the same group of guys and gals that you've always known. And so for every player that turns up with a cutthroat night gobbo or artillery train list, you will have 5, 6, 10 others who are running along with just the cool stuff. Someone who's running along with common goblins. Why do you bring common goblins? They're more expensive and worse than night goblins. Because I think they're neat. Why have you got orc boys and no black orcs? They're just going to impetuous themselves to death. That's okay. We don't really mind. So orcs and goblins are a really, really, really powerful army, and be prepared to see them win tournaments. But you're also going to have some of your best games against them, because at the end of the day, their community and their faction is very, very fun. We next have the properly evil buggers of Old World, and that is the Warriors of Chaos. In my humble opinion, Warriors of Chaos are the most powerful melee army in the game. There may be more experienced players that dispute that, and they're probably right. But when you're just playing against your mates, for the everyman on the street, if you line up against Warriors of Chaos, if one of your mates has got that army, be prepared to be getting smashed in combat. Nearly their entire army is weapon skill 4 or weapon skill 5 or higher. In fact, weapon skill 4 is considered very good in the Empire and is considered pretty basic in the Warriors of Chaos. They also have a surprisingly deep roster, and they can draw upon cheap hordes of marauders, or they can lean into dense elite phalanxes of Chaos Warriors. Now, some people will say that the actual Chaos Warrior units in the Warriors of Chaos aren't much to write home about, but as someone who has been up against them many times, do not underestimate it. When people say Chaos Warriors, the unit, are kind of weak, they're talking relatively. They're talking relatively within the Warriors of Chaos faction. A Chaos Warrior is still going to smack the bitch out of pretty much any other core choice in the game. It's just that there might be something else in the Warriors of Chaos faction that's going to smack even more bitch out of you. The main weakness of the Warriors of Chaos is they are quite elite. Each one of their models is very expensive, and it's going to have to cut down 2, 3, or even 4 of the enemy to be able to keep pace on the model count. Fortunately, they won't struggle to do that because Warriors of Chaos will beat pretty much anything in combat mano a mano. Maybe not the core Chaos Warriors, but things like Chosen and Forsaken and Dragon Ogres, and they've also got amazing characters on Dragon, and their magic is just great. Look, I would say individually, Warriors of Chaos are the best at everything, apart from shooting, which they have basically none. They're going to have the most powerful wizard builds. They're going to have the most powerful infantry builds. They're probably going to have the most powerful cavalry builds. Sorry, Bretonia. But what holds them back is they can't do it all. And even if they do have the most powerful wizard, they're only going to have like one of them. So a Warriors of Chaos army might have a Chaos Sorcerer on Dragon, and it's just a force to be reckoned with. But when they go up against someone like High Elves, who are themselves considered quite an elite army, he's still going to be outnumbered 2 to 1. And you start getting into Orcs Goblins who are just spamming out level 4 Gobbo mages left, right, and center. And that one guy is, he's going to beat everyone one-on-one, but he's never going to be one-on-one. And you might have the best magic and the best combat and the best cavalry and the best this and the best that, but you can't fit it all in one list. So you've got to pick, is my army going to have the best magic? Or is my army going to have the best combat? Or is my army going to have the best characters? But you're not going to have all of it. Whereas other factions can have their cake and eat it. I've already mentioned that Chaos Dragons are very good, but there are a couple of other units you're going to want to keep your eye on. Firstly, Forsaken. They're kind of like Chaos mutated Warriors of Chaos. And then you've also got the Dragon Ogres. Those are really, really efficient units. If you're looking to play your Warriors of Chaos kind of fluffy, then you find that most players lean into one god, being Mono Khorne or Mono Nurgle or Mono Tzeentch. But this is definitely not as locked in as you find in like Warhammer 40k. When you play 40k, you collect Death Guard and everything's got to be Nurgle, right? In Warriors of Chaos, there really isn't anything wrong with mixing and matching different marks inside an army. And if you're going to be competitive, you absolutely want to do that. If you go full Mono Khorne, you'll find you're very good in combat, but you have very little control over your army. And there are some armies and some units which are going to be able to abuse the fact that you're fully frenzied, for example. But really, to get the most out of your Warriors of Chaos, you want to have the tactical use of marks in certain units. And not every unit has to have a mark. You don't have to upgrade to Tzeentch or Slaanesh. Sometimes staying with Undivided is the right choice. Kind of like with the elves, we've had one chaos faction, yes, but what about second chaos faction? The Beastmen Breyherds are emerging from the forest, and oh boy, should we be scared. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I think Beastmen are the best army. I think they are the most powerful faction right now. A lot of people are arguing that Wood Elves are going to come in and start dominating the meta, but for me, Beastmen are already here and they're already phenomenal. If you look at a Beastman's profile, like the Humble Gore or Ungore, you might not really get what all the fuss is about. They don't really have any armor and their discipline is pretty shoddy. But with Beastmen, what makes them so good is you're not paying for stuff that you don't care about. A lot of armies will come with built-in light armor, but light armor is pretty much a waste of time. You're not bothered about light armor. A 6-up save ain't gonna do anything. A 5-up save is probably not gonna do anything either. Beastmen come with no armor, and therefore they don't pay for something they're not going to use. Instead, Beastmen save those points and then reinvest them into being utterly balls to the wall and having combat units that can even give Warriors of Chaos pause for thought. Because what is the hidden gem of the Beastmen is their special rules. They have got ways of getting reroll ones, they got ways of getting frenzy, ways of getting hated. They just pass leadership checks and suddenly they start going through the ceiling. And they can pass leadership checks fairly reliably thanks to their characters being quite high leadership and that they've got warband left, right and center in the army, which can give them easy access to boosted leadership. But it's not just about the quantity. It's not just about them being efficient and cheap. They also have quality. Like I said, they have a lot of rules that boost their effectiveness, but they also have a lot of units which are very strong. One of the things you're always going to encounter when you're playing against Beastmen Breyherds, and if you're going to take them, this should be at the top of every list, is a level 4 wizard. And you want to give that level 4 wizard the Hag Tree Fetish. This lets them reroll all wounds with magic missiles. You can combine that with one of the signature spells from the Lore of Beasts, which is called Viletide. This does 5d6 hits against an enemy unit. Now they're only strength 1, so typically you're wounding on 6s, but you get full rerolls because of the Hag Tree Fetish, and the enemy does not get any armor saves against it. Ward and regen are allowed, but ward and regen are typically 5-ups at best, often a 6-up. I have seen Viletide cut down entire units of elite Bretonnian cavalry. I have seen Viletide turn a brick of Dwarven mountain hold Longbeards into just a shadow of themselves. Sometimes it gets 5 hits. Sometimes it gets 30. And with rerolls in the picture, it can spike at the worst time for you when you're on the receiving end of it. And then you've got the Bestigors. Oh man. On their own, Bestigors don't seem that great. Just slightly better Gores, right, with great weapons. It's not about just them. It's about combining them with one of the most insane chaos mutations in the game, Slugskin. If you take a cheap Beast Lord and give him the Slugskin mutation and then put him inside a unit of Bestigors, you're probably never going to lose a combat with that unit because they've got weapon skill 4 base and then the Slugskin gives them -1 to hit. So typically when Bestigors get into combat with something, they're going to be hitting them on 5s. And that is really bad. Oh, man. Because if you're weapon skill 4 and their weapon skill 4, then you should be hitting on 4s, right? But no, it's -1 to hit, so you're hitting on 5s. If the Bestigors are going into something where they've got a higher weapon skill, then they're going to be hitting on 3s, and the enemy unit's going to be hitting on 5s. Even when you go into things that are better than you, maybe something's got a weapon skill of 5. That's okay. Rather than hitting you on 3s, now you're both hitting on 4s. That can level the playing field. Combine this with their blood frenzy, so if they pass that primal fury check on a double, they just go bonkers, with the fact that you could also upgrade them to be stubborn, and that they're not that expensive for elite stuff, and they can also take magical banners. Bestigors are just a phenomenal unit, and if you're a Beastman player or you're looking at getting into Beastman, you want to just get a block of 20 of them and put them into every army. But last and certainly not least, we have the Tomb Kings of Khemri. Now, a lot of people are going to be upset that the Tomb Kings of Khemri are considered a ravening horde, considered an evil faction, because truthfully, they are the ultra neutral faction of the setting. But I guess Games Workshop figured that skeletons and undead are traditionally seen as kind of bad, so they're getting lumped in with the proper evil guys like the Chaos faction. Tomb Kings are a reasonably popular faction. They're not quite on the same level as Orcs and Goblins or Chaos, where it feels like you're going to be guaranteed to pair into them every tournament, but there's always someone at every event who's got a Tomb Kings army. One of the defining things about the denizens of Khemri is they are undead, so they are all unbreakable. Now, unbreakable in Old World doesn't mean you automatically stick in combat. It just means that at best you're going to make them give ground, and they do actually have ways with the Nakaran phalanx of getting true unbreakable back, like in Old Warhammer Fantasy, where they don't move at all even if you beat them in combat. Some of you may be thinking that this sounds utterly broken because morale is such a big part of this game, and if you're just immune to it, surely you auto win every game. Well, Tomb Kings do crumble rather than break. So if they lose a combat, then they start losing models off the back of the unit. They start taking additional casualties. They can replenish them though. They have a ability called Arise, and if they start passing leadership checks, they're going to start replenishing those units and getting those casualties back. So when you fight against a Tomb King unit, make sure you wipe them out or you do enough damage to fully crumble them, because if you don't, then even though there's just a handful of them left, you will find that they start arising them and you have to start from the beginning. As for their units, they tend to fall into one of two fairly distinct categories. Either they are chaff or they are punchy. The basic skeleton warrior and archer is distinctly chaff and is not expected to actually do any damage. The Tomb King general knows he's a bit crappy, but he has a very important job. He's going to be sticky. He's going to tar pit you. And if you go into a big unit of skelly warriors, if they've got enough necromancy support behind them, they're going to keep coming back again and again and again. And you're going to be stuck there tar pitted the entire game. Whilst that's going on, the punchy units are going to be hurting you. And this is typically going to be in the form of a Necrosphinx. I both love and hate these things. I think they look really cool, and I respect the fact that they are very, very good, but I hate playing against them because they're a grind, man. They hit hard, and they are way more durable than they look because they've got a regen save. They're not flammable, so fire doesn't help you, and they are also indomitable too, which means even if you try and win by combat res, typically it's a long way to go. Be aware of the Necrosphinx, do not underestimate it, respect it. One last unit to mention is the Tomb Guard. These elite skeleton warriors bridge the gap between chaff and power. They have all sorts of upgrades available to them and can be well buffed by things like My Will Be Done and spells. I once made the mistake of just assuming Tomb Guard were slightly better skeleton warriors, and I paid the price for it. They're not going to go toe-to-toe with elite combat units. Warriors of Chaos will overrun them, but if they get into pretty much any other faction's core, they will beat that. So they're good bullies. They punch down onto core, can do okay into other special units, but they are not as elite as a lot of other elite combat armies. Oh yeah, and then there's the Tomb King's Bone Dragon. You're always going to fight a Bone Dragon. It's a really good, just dragon type model, and the fact that you can put a good wizard on top of it now, and the fact that it's in the starter box for the Tomb Kings, yeah, it's not just about phalanxes of infantry and a few necrofinks running around. that dragon's going to be something to take into account as well. But with all of that said, that is pretty much my hot takes on all of the core factions. I know what many of you are going to be thinking though. What about the legacy factions? What about my Skaven boys? What about my Lizard boys? To be honest with you, I haven't played against many legacy factions yet. I've played against Skaven a couple of times, but I've not played against ogres or dark elves or lizardmen or any of the other ones. So rather than doing a bunch of theory crafting hot takes, I want to wait until I've actually played them so I can give you guys some informed positions. One thing that I have learned from doing these oval videos is often when I do something based on theory craft, it doesn't actually line up with how things work on the tabletop. And so I want to make sure that I'm basing these videos on experience, because that has proven to be a better way of doing things. But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Which faction do you think is the most powerful right now? What do you think is the weakness? And do you have any additional insights? Maybe I missed something about the dwarves. Maybe there's an important factor I didn't take into account with the Beastmen and Breyherds. Get it down in that comment section, and then we can share all of that knowledge and become better players together. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like button and also subscribe to never miss an episode. Would you like to know more? If so, then please consider becoming a channel member or patron. By supporting the channel, not only will you be doing your part, but you'll also be helping me create more content for your viewing pleasure and unlocking a whole host of perks. You get everything from a badge next to your name, custom emojis, but the big one is access to the Mordian Glory Discord server, an online community with almost 2,500 active members. It's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got channels for army lists, hobbying, tactics, stories, and even a pretty spicy meme section as well. For all you greenhorns that wanted to see the Mordian glory hole, today is your lucky day. And joking aside, I do want to say a massive thank you to all of the current channel members and patrons. You guys are amazing, truly the lifeblood of the channel. I could not do Mordian Glory full time without the incredible and generous support of my members, so thank you guys so much. And last but certainly not least, I want to say a personal thank you to all of my top tier Patreons. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So a heartfelt thank you to Alex Dengal, Bon Vert, Lord Pryor, Mark Panconi, RJ Scorpion, Swordfish Trombone, Try Again Bragg, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, and August Barney. Seriously guys, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support is incredible and it makes a huge difference. Thank you so much. That's all for now. Hope you've all enjoyed today's video, and of course, as always, see you guys next time.